Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. I hope you had a great weekend. There is a lot that has taken place since we said goodbye on Friday, so we will certainly get into that. After 21 hours of negotiation, Vice President J.D. Vance said, no, we don't have any deal. I'm not sure that we believe that that would happen anyway. U.S. warships have entered the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to talk about what that means, and we will spend a significant amount of time in our second hour today talking about that, but and then eventually get into some other issues as well. The Great Migration continues, Gen Z, family and faith, and much more. But in this first hour, we're going to talk about MarriageTeam. And if you're not familiar with them, you will find information about that on the website. And we welcome to the microphone Al and Autumn Ray. They were married back in 1970 and were an Air Force family for 27 years. They are the co-founders of MarriageTeam, which is a nonprofit organization that strengthens and saves marriages. And I think you're going to find that some of the principles we're talking about apply to you whether you are married or not. But certainly, if you know married people, you need to pass this on to them if you are not married yourself. They have a great series which is called Rick and Jane Learn to Be Married. It's kind of like Dick and Jane, you might remember that. And I've got one of the books there, Listen and Talk, but that is a whole series that is available. Might just mention, of course, Al was in the Air Force. Autumn is a social worker, has a bachelor's degree in social work, and the two of them join us by phone. So Al and Autumn, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for having us, Kerby.
Yep. Thank you very much. We're happy to be here.
Well, one of the things I want to do is educate people about your organization. And first of all, if they go to pointofview.net, they'll see your picture, hit the button that says see more, visit the website, and that's the first start because then people will be able to take that to marriageteam.org. But I thought it would be good maybe just to have your testimony a little bit because, for example, some of the people that have endorsed your book, Dr. Gary Chapman's been on with us many times, and Jeff Kemp and a variety of others. I think of Marriage Savers and other ministries. Many times these organizations, these ministries develop out of some of the things that have happened in their background. And in some respects, your own story of faith and marriage is one of the reasons that you established MarriageTeam, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly right. We're always happy to share how MarriageTeam came about. Like many, probably, Kerby, of your listeners, we did not have a really great marriage. And we were Christians, and we were going to church, and I like to say we went to everything that had the word marriage on it. If it was a book, if it was a conference, if it was a class, talking to pastors, talking to counselors, I think you mentioned it, and Al and I did it. And we still could not get our relationship back on track. And so people listening probably think, boy, those guys are really dumb. And maybe we were really dumb, but there was something missing in all of the things that we tried. And when I started talking to the Lord about it, I said, what is up with this? You are a God of transformation. What is the matter with us? Why can't we be transformed? And this is what I figured out was missing, and Alan and I began MarriageTeam around this concept, is that people would tell us what we should do. And we would hear a lecture or we would read a book about what we could do, but we could not implement it ourselves. So we needed to have the opportunity over a period of time to practice the things that people were telling us. And that is how marriage coaching, the MarriageTeam organization, was born. Couples come alongside another couple for a period of 8 to 12 weeks. And you learn skills about being in a marriage. That's why our book series is called Rick and Jane Learn to Be Married, because people don't know how to be married. So MarriageTeam coaches are about helping people learn how to be married.
Well, and again, it seems to me that that's certainly a biblical idea of having individuals disciple you or mentor you, and that is something that we certainly have a great need for. And I might just mention that the series has Listen and Talk, the one I have in front of me, but you have some on anger, some on forgiveness, some on conflict, some on solving problems. And Al, I'd love to get your side of the story as well, because in some respects, if you've been in the military, here are the standards for performance. Here is the duty roster. And you just go out and do it. But marriage isn't quite that way, is it?
No, it isn't. And quite frankly, I was really focused on Air Force and career. And I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to where Autumn was. She was raising the kids, and I was focused on other things. So it was, in hindsight, it was obvious that we were going to have problems because I wasn't able to address all of the issues that needed to be addressed. As we started working with couples, though, it was very interesting because we came up with an analogy that explained everything and explained why we couldn't implement what we were being told. And we call it the playbook analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So you and your spouse are born onto different teams, your family of origin, and you learn your plays for life. It's how you see conflict handled, the personality differences, expectations, norms, all of that stuff. And that becomes your playbook. And that's the way you see the world. But then you get married, you create a new team, you bring your old playbook, and you don't share it very effectively. So it isn't that either of you are right or wrong, but you're different, and you don't know how to create common plays on how to work together to achieve your mutual goals. And as we started to work with couples, and that analogy really resonated, it was helpful for people to see that there was no blame, and it was about taking the skills and applying the skills and making the agreements on what you would do differently to meet each other's needs and to resolve your issues. So your teammate is not the enemy. They're your teammate to address the outside problem.
And, of course, we've had Dr. Gary Chapman on many times. Of course, he's one of the individuals that has endorsed your organization and your ministry and your books. And he talks about the fact that we speak different languages. We have different love languages and even sometimes different dialects in the love languages. Here's another aspect of that, which I'm so glad we're bringing out, because you come from different families of origins. And what's so intriguing to me is sometimes families from very significantly different parts of the world actually sometimes come together quite well because the way they treat conflict, the way they treat maybe organization, maybe the way they deal with the issue of anger, even though you look at the two of them and say, boy, you don't even look like your family of origin came from the same continent, but the families are similar. And then you have individuals that marry their high school sweetheart. They came from the same family, essentially, area, the same geography, it may be the same socioeconomic organization and everything, and yet they have some conflict. So I want to take a break and want to come back and maybe focus on a little bit more about what you are involved with, because in some respects you're engaged in what we might call marriage coaching versus counseling, and I think you've already gotten a little bit of a hint when we talked about this idea of the playbook, but I want to kind of develop that a little bit more. And during the breaks, this would be a great time for you to go to like MarriageTeam.org. That's where you can find out a little bit more about what they're doing in terms of marriage coaching. There also is a section there on premarital coaching, as well as some other opportunities for you to find out a little bit more. So some great principles here. Obviously, if you are married, this applies to you, but even if you're not, I think you're going to find some very helpful ideas about communication, about conflict resolution, and much, much more. Privileged to have with us today Al and Autumn Ray. They're, of course, with Marriage Team, and we'll continue with them right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me start with a simple question. What is the price of a barrel of oil today? I recorded this commentary a week ago, so the price has probably changed. Over the weekend, it was $140 a barrel, which is twice what it was before the Iran war. One insider tracked the price as high as $173 a barrel. The bigger issue isn't just the price, but availability. As I record this, energy markets in Europe and Asia have been affected. One headline reads, "The Strait of Hormuz crisis is driving a wave of global energy rationing." Some airlines have had to cut back or cancel flights because they can't get fuel. The head of the International Energy Agency said the energy crisis may be bigger than the oil shocks of the 1970s. The price of oil and the lack of oil affects everything. Think of products made from oil. Obviously, that would include gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, kerosene, etc. But petrochemicals also produce plastics, rubber, textiles, detergents, clothing, health products, fertilizer, and pesticides. That's why another headline reads, "The global oil crisis is turning into an everything crisis." As I record this, there are a few of these headlines, but not too many. There's still hope that the Iran war will end soon, but even if it does, there will still be an oil shock. One economist warns that the world economy cannot survive a 7% to 11% loss of oil supply. I bring this up because the lack of supplies and problems with supply chains will affect you and your family. You may not be hearing too much about this because we tend to take so much for granted until something goes wrong. A wise and discerning Christian will pay attention and should plan accordingly. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Al and Autumn Ray with us as we are talking about their organization and ministry, MarriageTeam, and you can go to MarriageTeam. Find out a little bit more there as well. Let me, if I can, come to you both and talk about maybe the difference between marriage counseling, which I suspect many of our listeners have been through, and marriage coaching, because the difference is more than just in words. It's really in the approach, isn't it?
It is. The approach for coaching, a coach is designed to take you from where you are to where you want to go. I mean, that's how coaching got started, that very simple definition of a coach. And coaches help couples go from wherever they are, whether it's pretty dysfunctional or fairly well-functioning, to where they want to be to achieve their goals. And they do that by asking questions, and they assume that the couple is the expert on their relationship. So that doesn't mean the couple has a great relationship. It just means that when the couple when one rolls their eyes or sighs, the other one knows what's going on. So they can read each other. They understand the dynamics in their relationship. The coach, on the other hand, is the expert on the process, and the process is coaching. It's about asking questions, creating awareness, helping couples to reframe their thinking, challenging their assumptions, and getting them to talk together so that they can really understand one another. And that's a little bit different than counseling, where when people go to a counselor, they often have issues that they're looking for direction. They're looking for somebody to point out what they should be doing. Where coaches never give advice, counselors often give advice, and they have the training and the background to be able to do that. So, for instance, in coaching, coaches do not work with couples that really do need counselors. Things such as addictions, abuse,
Right.
mental health issues that are untreated, all of those things really lend themselves to counseling, not coaching.
As a matter of fact, you even have a section on your website about the difference and the similarities between coaching and counseling. And maybe if I could come to Autumn for just a minute, it is usually the case that women are better listeners and communicators than men. So maybe give us an idea of how that would work out in terms of coaching, because it does seem to me that that is one of the most important aspects of a marriage, good communication.
Well, exactly. And I think anyone who's married knows that communication is probably at the basis of a good marriage or at the basis of a poor marriage. So that is exactly where we start. Listening, we believe, is the relationship skill that is the most important for marriage. So it's not that people don't want to have a good marriage. It's not that people don't want to treat each other kindly. We think people just don't have the skills and they don't know how. So we began this with coaching and then found out, wow, these are actually skills that people could learn on their own. And then we created the whole series of 8 books. Like we talked about a playbook. You both read these books. You both do the exercises in the books. You get on the same page together, and you have a whole playbook for your marriage, beginning with how to communicate, like you said, through all the other skills that you need, appreciating differences, solving problems, resolving conflict, cultivating intimacy. You can't. I'm glad you touched on that, Kerby, because intimacy is so involves good communication. So let's start with communication and work ourselves into great intimacy, which is why we got married. Many of us, we want that in our relationships, right?
And one aspect of coaching for both of you is that, for example, in the one book that I have, which is one of the 8, you have a section where there's a skill self-assessment. Now, Al, I can think of coaches I've had that sometimes say, okay, this play didn't work. What did we do wrong? Or in particular, if he's looking at me, what did you do wrong? And it seems to me that that is different than the counselor saying, now, if you just did this, because it's a slight difference, but it's significant because now you are doing the evaluation. You recognize where your strengths and, most importantly, where your weaknesses are. And so this idea of self-assessment fits a lot better with the idea of coaching, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that we're looking at behavior change because you want to change, but you don't know how. That's what we're looking at. So how do you change? You have to know what's going wrong before you can figure out what's going right. So everything starts with that assessment in all of these skills. Let's assess where we are right now. Well, we know that all these things don't work. Now, are we motivated to change? Most people, if they're going to come to coaching, if they're going to buy a book, Kerby, they're motivated to change, right? So now we're motivated to change. So how do we do it? And that's in each of the books, too. There's a better way to do things. You can adopt it if you want to. You can modify it if you want to for your relationship. But there's always has to be an action after the assessment. And then here's the thing. When you start doing the action, how many times do you say, oh, I'm going to do this? And how many times do you actually do it? So we have built in a relapse play for each person in the relationship. You know that you want to do this right, but when you don't, who's going to notice it? Your teammate, your spouse is going to notice that you're not communicating the way you said you were going to. You're interrupting, you're getting defensive, you're thinking about what you want to say instead of what your teammate's saying, and the other person is noticing them because there's a pinch. So we have developed this relapse play so that you say to your teammate, when I do that, when I interrupt you or when I get defensive and you're talking to me, I don't want to do that because that's going to ruin our communication. So I'm going to give you permission to say this to me. You can say, honey, I know that you're really trying, but this isn't working for me right now. I'm hearing this. Or you can make up whatever words you want. And because your teammate is the one that's going to give you the words, these magic words, that when you say them, the teammate will then respond to them. So yes, it's all great to have great intentions, but what happens when those intentions go south? You have to have a play for that.
Very
and
good.
Habits are so hard to change that's why working together is so important in order to change those habits.
Let's see if we can maybe talk about some people right now say, okay, well, who's the coach? And in your booklets, you have some things like marriage coaches are ordinary couples who learn coaching skills to help other marriages. So in some respects, you recognize that this is a process and other people can learn to be marriage coaches. But the ones you have right now, how are they developed into the most effective coach?
Well, there's pretty extensive training, and when I say extensive, it's 2 weekends where couples go through the material they'll be coaching on, and then they actually practice the coaching skills. So it would be like watching somebody to ride a bike and say, oh, I can do that. But I think most of us have had a few scrapes along the way as we tried to learn. So what we do is we build in those scrapes into the training so couples actually practice the coaching skills with one another and get a sense. And there's there's mentor coaches available when they're doing that practicing to help them really learn the skills and be able to apply the skills. Because it gets right along with coaching. Knowing the skills is not going to make a difference if you're not applying the skills. The thing that improves a relationship is behavior change. And when behaviors change, the feelings change. So it's all about creating agreements and following through on your agreements, because that builds trust in one another, and it strengthens the relationship.
In some respects, it reminds me of the kinds of things that pastors listening right now can appreciate. You know, I've been preaching sermons for years. I've been telling people how to live the Christian life. But when it comes to taking those principles from what I've communicated in the pulpit into their lives, they need the next step. And that's, of course, what discipling and mentoring is all about. In this case, coaching. And it does seem to me that there are many people just like yourself that said, yeah, I've gone to some of these marriage weekends and I've been to marriage counselors, but I'm not seeing any kind of change. So when we come back, I thought maybe we'd talk a bit more about how that coaching really works. But that's a perfect time for all of you. If you would like to know a little bit more about the Marriage Team, you can go to MarriageTeam.org. There's a place where you can then take some next steps. As I've pointed out before, there's marriage coaching, premarital coaching, become a volunteer coach couple, which we just sort of alluded to a minute ago. There is a video to watch. There are some other possible ways to look at that, and even to look at this whole idea of marriage coaching from a child's perspective, because no doubt you might have children involved in that as well. And then just a whole section on some of these other issues about coaching, fighting, dealing with this, some of the training that's involved. And so if you'd like to know more, we have, of course, all that information at MarriageTeam.org. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones if you have any comments or questions about that. But I do want to get back into this whole idea of, well, what does that coaching actually look like? And if you are ready to maybe connect up with these individuals, Al and Autumn, I wanted to make that possible for you as well, but also maybe give you a chance to ask a question so we can see what we can do to have marriages that are flourishing. We'll be back with more right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Al and Autumn Ray, and if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. I think for both of you, maybe the questions that are coming through people's minds right now are, okay, this seems like something that maybe I've never tried before. I don't know what maybe marriage coaching looks like, and maybe I've already gone to the website MarriageTeam.org, and I'm sort of wondering, okay, what's the next next step. What does that look like? What am I signing up for? Can it be done in person, online? How many sessions? Can you kind of answer some of those questions, which I'm sure in the minds of many people listening right now?
Sure, Kerby, I'd be happy to. The books that you mentioned earlier, like Rick and Jane Learn to Listen and Talk, really describe very clearly what the coaching process looks like. And they can be found at a different website at rickandjane.com. So one way that people can get a good feel for what coaching looks like is by getting one of the books and seeing how Rick and Jane interact with their coaches. But to answer your question, yes, coaching can be done in person, but it also is very often done remotely. So as long as people have a video conference capability, it could be Teams, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever, they can effectively coach. Because what the coaches are looking for is for body language and things that may not be being said, but need to be said and expressed. So with a video connection, coaching is just as effective as it is in person. So that is one way that coaches can, minimize the impact of geography.
One of the things I might just mention, as you point out, is if you get one of the books, and I'll hold up right now just maybe one of the pages where you can see Rick and Jane. And so you really kind of choose to use some characters because in some respects then you can follow their journey through the many chapters, in this case 10 chapters, and you can kind of see how they start, how they interact, how the coaches ask questions, how they work on it, how then they deal with some really important issues that I think illustrate again that you've been doing this for a while, because you look at the possibility then that we're going to need to deal with somebody that's relapsed or maybe needs to go back and begin to rethink what their original commitments were all the way to the end. So in some respects, it's sort of fictional, but it's, I think, based upon some real life experiences that you've had over the years in terms of coaching, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And it's the story-based learning where here you have Rick and Jane don't have a really great marriage. They're trying to figure it out. So they go to visit the coaches, Sam and Sally. And each book is a different story of a visit to their coach. And you ask really good questions, Kerby, about, what would people want to know before they sign up for this? And that is one of the reasons that we wrote the book. We really want to demystify what coaching looks like. It's not something to be afraid of. It's not something to think somebody's going to take a side. Somebody's going to put you on the spot. It's very relational. It's very friendly. And we wanted people to be able to see that. And that's the reason we wrote the books. But if people are looking at the website, which you so kindly pointed them to, MarriageTeam, that all they have to do is fill out the intake form, and someone will contact them about getting started with coaching. How long does coaching last? Coaching is about 8 to 12 weeks, probably at the most, and you will usually meet with a coach online. Like right now, Alan and I are coaching a couple in New Hampshire, and we live in the state of Washington. And so we do it online. So that's what the expectation would be. You would meet for about 2 hours with a couple, and you'd meet once a week.
Very good. And again, a lot of that is already on the website, and we gave you the other link there as well to the Rick and Jane series. You can find all of those on our website at pointofview.net. But I thought for just a minute, since we've been talking about listening, one other one is conflict. And the reason I'm bringing that up is last Monday, we had Stephen Curtis Chapman, the musician, and his wife, Mary Beth Chapman. And I've, of course, known a little bit about them, but you can read through one of their books, and in particular, the one that we spent some time talking about was how different they were, because I suspect they came, back to Al's point, from very different families of origin, but even more so, they are very different. I mean, he's your kind of right hemisphere creative individual. She's your classic left hemisphere logical linear. One of the illustrations they use, she's a spreadsheet, he's a doodle pad or something something like that. And so in some respects, you have one of your books on the issue of resolving conflict, and marriage is all about resolving conflict. And this is where, again, you almost need a coach, dare I even say a referee, to deal with some different expectations and assumptions that have created some of the conflict, don't you?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because the resolving conflict really focuses on the things that you do, the habits that you have that are destructive, and the ones you can use to replace them with constructive habits. And it's about the process of dealing with conflict. The differences you talk about are really in the sixth book, which is appreciating differences.
Right.
Because God made each of us different, and we don't appreciate the differences. It may be what first attracted us, that the person was a real outgoing extrovert and we were an introvert, and that was very attractive. But over time, that can become a real annoyance in a relationship. And that book, the sixth book in the series, really focuses on helping couples to appreciate the God-given differences that their teammate has, and to see them that it helps to balance things out. And that if they were both alike, I've heard it said, if two people are alike, you don't need one of them. So it just goes to, God's design for marriage, where two become one and they work together to overcome those differences.
I was sitting here thinking about the conflict, and I was thinking I would like to just share. When I came into my marriage, I had a play in my playbook that said, if Alan loved me and cared about me, he'd know what I needed and wanted. So I know everyone laughed, but that was my play. And unfortunately, Alan did not have that play in his playbook. And I did not have a play that said, oh, I can tell Alan what I need and want, because that didn't go along with him loving me and caring about me enough to mind read and know what I need and wanted. So there you have some conflict at the get-go. How are you going to resolve that? Well, you have to change your thinking, first of all, about that it's not okay to tell somebody what you need and want. So that's what coaching will help someone do, is reframe their thinking. And so now I have a play, Kerby, in my playbook that says, when I'm not hearing what I need and want, when I'm feeling like I'm going to leave a conversation because I'm not getting what I want, I get to speak up and I get to say, honey, I know this isn't what we want in our relationship. I know we want to be close to each other. This is actually driving me away. I know you probably don't see it, but this is what's happening to me. So you develop these new plays so that you can eliminate conflict.
I just love that because, again, you go into any game, and I've played some sports, and, of course, we've all been watching sports, and you have a playbook, but then when the reality hits pretty quickly, you've got to change the playbook. You've got to add some plays or delete some plays from the playbook, and that's a great illustration. And back to the point you made just a minute ago, because when we look at the series, you have one on listen and talk, one on conquer anger, one on forgive. The one I was talking about was resolve conflict, but then you have one on solve problems, number 6, to appreciate differences, and number 7, to cultivate intimacy, and finally number 8, the secret. And you point out that that's one of those issues of appreciate differences. As we've said before on this program many times, opposites attract, and then they attack, because what first drew you to that individual oftentimes becomes a great annoyance, and this is just another playbook to think about that as well. We're coming to a break, so when we come back, I know there's some other questions that people have, and one of those, given the fact that we have pastors, elders, deacons, small group leaders, and others, they might be thinking, well, this is great, but do you have something that the churches might be able to use to strengthen marriages in their congregation? Are you available to speak on these issues? Are these resources that we could put in our church library, and a variety of other things? Because certainly many people are listening to this individually, but I know some of our listeners are listening to it corporately, saying, that's very good, and I'm glad you're up there in the state of Washington, but we're in Mississippi, or we're in Indiana or Illinois, or we're maybe in New Hampshire, or you were talking about, or Texas or California, wherever we might be, and we probably would benefit by having some of those resources in our church. So when we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And if you have any comments or questions before we move on to some of the topics in the second hour, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We have some links. Again, the first one probably to start would be, of course, MarriageTeam.org. There is where you can get some of your questions answered, and we will come back, see if we can answer a few more with Al and Autumn Ray right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Al and Autumn Ray. And if you go to MarriageTeam.org, upper right-hand corner, there's a drop-down menu, and there is a marriage team for churches and for business. I thought we'd first of all talk about churches, because a number of our listeners might say, well, is there like a ministry model that we could use within our church? How can that connect up with you?
Well, the ministry model is for churches to make referrals to MarriageTeam for couples that are struggling in their marriage, and then we can come alongside and provide the coaching, work with the pastor to make sure that the couples get what they need in order to strengthen and save their marriage. The other thing for a church resource, you earlier mentioned the books, and they can buy the books to put in their library at rickandjane.com. So that's another resource that they have. It's just currently not on the Marriage Team site. It's on a separate site. But rickandjane.com would be the site where people can get the books.
Again, some great resources there. Since I did mention business, that is something I appreciated the fact that you had that as well. Why have a faith-based marriage coaching benefit for your employees? Well, because happy employees are more productive. And then, of course, you can also have a section there on work-life balance and all sorts of other issues. So this is something that maybe an individual that has a small business or is part of a major corporation could provide those resources as well, because if anything, if you want your business to flourish, it's probably going to be more likely to flourish if the marriages of the people employed is flourishing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why that program was created, was to give small businesses an opportunity to provide a service for their couples. And we've had several businesses that have done that, and it really shows an investment in their couple's emotional health and satisfaction. And you said it perfectly. Happy employees do a better job than those that are, worried about who's taking care of the kids and all the other issues that go with struggling marriages. So that is a benefit that employers can provide, and all that information is available on the website and by calling Marriage Team.
Might just mention we have links to Facebook and X and, of course, the website and much, much more. But just before we ran out of time, I thought we'd talk about your success. And that is sometimes we, of course, on a Friday, talk about some of these various court battles, and we've looked at First Liberty Institute that's 11-0, won all 11 of their cases before the Supreme Court. We've had people from Alliance Defending Freedom where they win more than 90% of their cases. But I've looked, and it does appear to me that you have, over these 2 decades, been able to take a lot of couples that were seriously considering divorce and decide not to get divorced. What about that?
Well, you're exactly correct on that, because couples that are like that, they see divorce as the only option. They've lost hope. But at the very first session, when they go through the listening to understand exercise, they can see that there's hope, that they can feel understood by one another. And that is so critical. But when people have the skills and they're working together, it's amazing how the feelings change when the behaviors change. If you were to ask a couple, do you want a divorce or do you want to be happy again? Most couples will say they just want to be happy. And they can be happy in their current marriage if they just can adopt some behaviors that are going to strengthen the marriage as opposed to tearing it apart.
Wow. Let's see if we can spend a little bit of time talking about the books, because that seems to be the entry point. rickandjane.com. And if you look under the books there, then you can actually see each one of those, which I've mentioned just a minute ago. Then there's a facilitator's guide, a couple's workbook, a variety of others. So even if you are either an individual looking at this, or this is a couple looking at this, or a church, or even a business, that seems to be a good place to start, because then it gives you a sense of what that is, where that's going, and how that will be approached. But what would you recommend?
Oh, I totally agree with that. That is a great entry point, because people get a sense of marriage coaching as a easy, approachable, friendly thing, no blame, and it is designed to build and to normalize the fact that if you're married, you've got problems. Every one of us that's been married has gone through some rough spots, and you don't have to do that on your own. There's help available, and it doesn't have to be scary. Couples universally report that the coaching process was friendly, they felt comfortable, and it really strengthened their marriage. So, yes, that is a great entry point, the books, or simply calling Marriage Team. Either one will work.
Might just mention, you do have a contact us. A couple of things. First of all, that's where you can learn about the series, which I think is certainly well done. You also have a place where you could be invited to come and speak, or even if you have some general inquiries. I suspect that there are probably some questions that people want to ask, but not in front of a national audience. So that is a place where you can send a message, ask a question, and someone can get back to you. Or if you want to make a phone call, you can do that as well. So we have a couple of the different links that you might want to use, because we think that learning about these various organizations are very helpful. And one of the reasons we wanted to have, of course, the whole idea of a marriage team was for you to know that there's a MarriageTeam.org and a rickandjane.com website. You have all that information there. We have a Facebook post and a variety of other things. So, Al and Autumn, thank you for educating our listeners and giving them some hope about the future of their own marriages.
Well, thank you, Kerby. You've done a wonderful job of outlining all of the opportunities that are there. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a wonderful time.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, guess what? We are going to be talking about what's in the news. You might even notice that as you go to the website and find out a little bit more about Marriage Team, that if you scroll down, my Viewpoints commentary today is about the oil crisis. We'll talk about that. What about the Strait of Hormuz? It looked like there might be a possibility of a break in the negotiations, but after 21 hours, Vice President J.D. Vance, and I actually watched that live, said, nope, not real surprised about that, but it just illustrates how unwilling Iran is about giving up their desire to have a nuclear weapon. And so now, of course, Donald Trump has sent warships into the Strait of Hormuz, and as one of the pieces we've posted, Trump blockades the blockaders in Iran. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Then I do want to get into some other issues. If we weren't involved in a war with Iran right now, there are many issues taking place locally and nationally that we will cover as well. So those are resources that we have posted on the website, in addition to, of course, the link to this whole series of Marriage Team or Rick and Jane series that you might want to know more about. So as you go to the website, let me encourage you to take advantage of any of the resources we have there. As always, we, of course, have a video. We have some take action items, which we'll get back to. And most importantly, as we are coming to this celebration of America 250, we have still kept up our banner here, 1776 to 2026, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. And one of the things we're going to be spending some time talking about over the next couple of months is how we can educate ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren about America's godly heritage. So we'll take a break, and when we come back, let's get into some of these really important issues in the news. When we said goodbye on Friday, lots happened over the weekend, so we'll bring you up to date right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, that's we can focus a little time and attention on what's going on in Iran. And the first one is a piece that I've posted here after 21 hours of negotiation. Vice President J.D. Vance provides an update. And as Matt Vespa says, not shocking. We'll then get into a piece by Joseph Califant, some pieces that come from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, all the way down to some individuals we've had on this program. I'll be quoting from Ken Timmerman and Kevin McCullough. So there's just a number of different viewpoints trying to get some sense on what is happening there. And you might say, well, why don't we just take the official stance? Well, I think we recognize that just because somebody says it, whether it's the president, the secretary of state, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, you need to sometimes look a little deeper, and that's what we're going to try to do. But Matt Vespa put it this way. Look, we're dealing with terrorists. So he says, I don't understand why we're expecting anything different after the vice president, J.D. Vance, stepped out to brief the press following 21 hours of negotiation. He was there, Jared Kushner was there, Steve Witkoff was there, and the bottom line is, he said, the bad news is we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States. They have chosen not to accept our terms. But let me dig into that a little bit because I think that gives you a sense of what is happening. He says, we leave here with a very simple proposal, a method to understand that is our final and best offer. We won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we've negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. What I think is so interesting is, given the fact that this is a group that isn't really very honest anyway, why didn't they just decide to say, okay, we agree with you, and then go ahead and do it anyway? Because we know exactly what will happen oftentimes with this particular group. But nevertheless, the red lines, as he said, are very clear. There are some things we might accommodate on, but that's not one of them. It is interesting because you can then take some of the things the president has posted and at least take at face value and then even read between the lines what is there. But one of the things he posted was at some point we'll reach an all being allowed to go in, all being allowed to go out basis. But Iran has not allowed that to happen in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, which is what we'll get to in just a minute in terms of sending in the warships. But in terms of the negotiation, one of the things the president said on Sunday, and again, you have to take some of this with a little bit of a grain of salt or a bag of salt. I'll let you figure that out. In which he said, really, on their so-called 10-point plan, most of the agreement was there. Again, you don't know how much of the Iranian delegation would just agree with it just to get further down the road. But the point that was the sticking point was the one, of course, that J.D. Vance mentioned, and that is there was no agreement on the nuclear issue. And ultimately, of course, the president said that's the only one that really matters. But that led, of course, to this idea of a blockade. And the president has now made it very clear that the U.S. Navy will seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. And I'll come back to why that may be significant in just a minute. But that's when we began, after this announcement that took place, and I was watching it live on Saturday night, which was, of course, about 6 o'clock in the morning there in the area of Pakistan. Immediately then you had, and I'm giving you some reports now, several U.S. Navy ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz, and the move was not coordinated with Iran. It's the first time this has happened since the beginning of the war. One U.S. official said that the warships crossed the Strait of Hormuz from east to west to the Gulf and then made their way back through the strait to the Arabian Sea. One official said this is an operation that focused on freedom of navigation through international waters. And again, one of the statements from the president, that the U.S. is now, quote, starting the process of clearing out the Strait of Hormuz to help reopen the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf. And it says that we're also in the process, and I don't exactly know what this means, that we will clear out all 28 of Iran's mine droppers at the bottom of the sea. That was kind of ambiguous. Do you mean the mines that are in the sea, or do you mean the mine droppers, the ships themselves? Probably a little of both. But nevertheless, this has been used then now as the Iranian government saying that this is a violation of the ceasefire and threatening to attack our ships. So sometimes these problems go from bad to worse. But if you want oil to make its way to some individuals who are in need of that, you can begin to see what the problem is. And it, I think, relates very much to the commentary that I have today, which has the title, The Oil Crisis. And I wrote it, of course, a week ago, in which I even at the time pointed out the fact that, let me start with a simple question. What is the price of oil today? As I was recording the commentary a week ago, it had reached up to $140 a barrel. It's now under that, obviously, but one had gone as high as $173 a barrel. And price is one thing, but the bigger issue is availability. That is, price is something that some might be able to handle for a while, although it is affecting inflation, very clearly it is. But the availability issue is much bigger in that regard. And so I gave you a headline from Time magazine, of all places. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is driving a wave of global energy rationing. I think I've mentioned on this program, I have a colleague that I'm in a church with who actually has told some of her associates that were in India that if they only had a half a tank of gas in the rental car, drive to the airport, fly home. And the reason for that is, at that time, I don't know where we are today, don't think it's any better, the gas stations in in India are closed. And there is a very significant pressure right now on China, all sorts of places around Southeast Asia, not to mention Europe, when again, 20% of the world's oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and very few ships have come through the Strait of Hormuz. You can see the issue. And when we come back, I want to pick up the other part, which we talk about that as well, because another headline said the global oil crisis is turning into an everything crisis, because think of how many things are manufactured through oil. So we'll talk about the blockade, get some very good perspective from Ken Timmerman. I did not post this, although maybe I should, if for no other reason than he helps us understand how Iran holds a few of the islands that are supposed to be islands of UAE, and why, because of this, it's hard sometimes to even get ships through the Strait of Hormuz because of some of the danger. But I'll go in and explain a little bit more of that in just a moment. And of course, anywhere along the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me start with a simple question. What is the price of a barrel of oil today? I recorded this commentary a week ago, so the price has probably changed. Over the weekend, it was $140 a barrel, which is twice what it was before the Iran war. One insider tracked the price as high as $173 a barrel. The bigger issue isn't just the price, but availability. As I record this, energy markets in Europe and Asia have been affected. One headline reads, "The Strait of Hormuz crisis is driving a wave of global energy rationing." Some airlines have had to cut back or cancel flights because they can't get fuel. The head of the International Energy Agency said the energy crisis may be bigger than the oil shocks of the 1970s. The price of oil and the lack of oil affects everything. Think of products made from oil. Obviously, that would include gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, kerosene, etc. But petrochemicals also produce plastics, rubber, textiles, detergents, clothing, health products, fertilizer, and pesticides. That's why another headline reads, "The global oil crisis is turning into an everything crisis." As I record this, there are a few of these headlines, but not too many. There's still hope that the Iran war will end soon, but even if it does, there will still be an oil shock. One economist warns that the world economy cannot survive a 7% to 11% loss of oil supply. I bring this up because the lack of supplies and problems with supply chains will affect you and your family. You may not be hearing too much about this because we tend to take so much for granted until something goes wrong. A wise and discerning Christian will pay attention and should plan accordingly. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and in this particular segment, I'm going to be quoting from 3 separate articles, but they're all sort of saying the same thing. One is from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, one from Ken Timmerman, who's been on the program with us before, another one from Kevin McCullough, who's also been with us, a fellow talk show host, and the first one I'll look at is, of course, the one from Wall Street Journal, in which I love how they said this. We're a long way from Tuesday night's declaration of victory over Iran, and the good news is President Trump seems to know it. He points out that, of course, the negotiations in Pakistan went nowhere by Saturday, so on Sunday, President Trump announced a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz for ships using Iranian ports. And again, if you will, the misjudgment on the part of the leaders in Iran took Donald Trump's eagerness for a ceasefire as a sign of desperation and confirmation that its energy strategy is working, and it's not. And of course, J.D. Vance made the point that, again, if he even you had the suggestion by the Iranian leaders that they would, for a while at least, not try to achieve a nuclear weapon, we might have gone along, but they are unwilling, as he pointed out in his Truth Social, to give up its nuclear ambitions. And the piece by the Wall Street Journal was instructive because if you're not familiar with our history, and I know some of you might be younger, did not live through the time in which Barack Obama was president, you might not be aware of the fact that they go into some detail during the negotiation for President Barack Obama's 2015 nuclear deal. The Iranian foreign minister walked out of the negotiations. And what happened? The U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, ran after him. And we'll pick up that again in Kevin Timmermans in just a minute. And so by walking away, Donald Trump tells the regime not to expect a repeat. And so if nothing else, Iran, as they point out, now has an incentive to restore traffic in the strait, as does China, whose tankers have been given priority, rather than smuggle new air defenses to Iran. The U.S. intelligence suspects it's doing. It's quite possible that China might pressure the regime, the Iranian regime, to resume oil shipments because it's hurting the Chinese economy. Okay. Donald Trump says the Navy will even seize tankers that have paid a toll to make it out of the Gulf, which is another blow to China. And it brings us back to when they pay the toll. I'll hold this up because this comes from the Financial Times. We talked about it on Friday. They pay the toll in Bitcoin. Matter of fact, we had off air kind of a back and forth between me and Dr. Merrill Matthews because he said, well, isn't it other cryptocurrency? No, I mean, because you could close down any other cryptocurrency because Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, if you will. There's no way that the United States or even other countries could close it down. And so that's why it's in Bitcoin, because there are all sorts of American U.S. sanctions against Iran. Nevertheless, that is the case. Any reduction in energy flows, even from the trickle that Iran has been allowing, will be felt by the markets, by our allies, especially in Asia. Oil prices will spike if the blockade is enforced in any length, and that becomes the next issue, which is why I didn't post this piece by Kim Timmerman. I might do that later. But he points out that it's his assumption that the Iranian regime seems to have not taken the measure of Donald Trump, even after, in his case, he wrote this a week ago, or a few days ago. So that was 30 days of war. Now it's up to about 44, I think we're up to as well. And again, pointing out that when you talk about the Strait of Hormuz, he's got a great chart, which I'll show at least to those you watching online, because I was unaware of how they have to go around the Larak Island, but then when they go through the normal passageway, they go by some islands that are technically part of United Arab Emirates, the UAE, but right now those small islands are occupied by Iran. And so again, the United States has three non-negotiables going into these talks. Number one, Iran cannot enrich uranium. Number two, Iran must give up its stockpile of 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And number three, Iran must open the international waterways in the Strait of Hormuz without tolls or impediment. And of course, he then points out the fact that Donald Trump the other day said there are reports that Iran is charging fees. Well, I think that's pretty much established. But at the same time, because this is such a choke point, which is even more restricted because of the islands now that are occupied by Iran, it seems like, and again, I could be wrong, but I'm using their facts on the table here, that the only things that have really been able to get through have been relatively small oil tankers or LNG ships. That would be liquid natural gas, or maybe some bulk carriers. Again, what is so intriguing about this, Ken Timmerman says it's unclear if a super tanker loaded with 2 billion barrels of oil, or else even a Supermax container ship, could even negotiate the sharp turn which is required to go around Larak Island. So A lot of interesting things being played out as well. He does mention one other thing before I get to my piece by Kevin McCullough, which we've posted for you to read on the website. But interestingly enough, he also points out that the British Prime Minister has been touring the Gulf countries in an attempt to kind of shore up British arms export contracts. But he points out that, we keep wondering whether or not NATO has been much of an ally. I did not know this. And this is, again, where Ken Timmerman, who's been kind of a foreign policy individual for some time, has said that if you look at it, the Saudis actually have more combat jets than the United Kingdom, and the Emirati Air Force has as many as the UK. So if you're talking about military preparedness, we're better prepared in the Middle East with some of those countries than we are from Great Britain. Who would have known? Let me, before I take a phone call, mention that my piece by Kevin McCullough is entitled What Stupid Ayatollahs? And he talks about this classic scene in Hoosiers where the interim coach, who's played in that case by Gene Hackman, is declining his willingness to maybe deal with his character. And so one of the individuals says to the Gene Hackman character, there are two kinds of stupid in this world. One is the kind where a man gets naked and barks at the moon in the middle of the woods. The other is the man who does the same thing in his living room. And Kevin McCullough says the Ayatollahs don't realize it, but they're in the living room and they don't seem to know it. We have a regime, he points out, that has completely misread the moment. For decades, they have operated under the idea that when there's pressure on, a president will capitulate. And he gives a couple examples with Carter and Obama and others. But he says, first of all, their first mistake is this president is not one of those guys. Then when they are failing, even though their position is weakened militarily, economically, diplomatically, they still keep acting as if they're dictating the terms. And they really don't understand the pressure that they're under. He says they stall, they reject, they posture, they delay, and in so doing, they just simply do not understand the room that they're in. And he says some of this is not self-generated by years of inconsistent Western responses. They always accept and believe that this particular situation will be like the past, but it really hasn't worked out that way. The Ayatollahs are making the exact same mistake. They're treating this like the kind of negotiations they've been in the past, and that is not the case. So interestingly of all that, they really should be willing to adapt or absorb the consequences, but instead they're stalling. So as he said, they walked into the living room thinking they're still standing alone in the woods. They assumed that the same old tricks would work. They believed the same old patterns would hold, but the room has changed. The stakes have changed, and the man across from them is not playing by the old rules. So we'll come back and take some phone calls if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But let me just mention as we go to a break, my commentary today reminds us that maybe the price of oil isn't as high as it was a week ago, but the price is only one issue. Availability is a bigger issue. And you might say, well, I don't need that much gasoline. Well, yes, but oil and petroleum products not only give us gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and kerosene, they also give us things like, plastics and rubber, textiles, detergents, clothing, health products, fertilizers, that's going to be important, pesticides, and much more, which is why one of the other headlines said the global oil crisis is turning into an everything crisis. So again, we recognize that we are facing some financial headwinds. We've been talking about that for a while here on Point of View. But when we come back, we'll take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Then we'll move on to some very important issues domestically and nationally that we need to talk about. All that coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to California, KNLB, and Kathy, thank you for calling today.
Yes, there was some thought back at the time when Ben Gurion was Prime Minister of building the Ben Gurion Canal, which would be deeper, wider, and would empty into the Mediterranean. And I know the cost of that has gone up. And that would take it out of the Red Sea. The thing about that is, though, it would involve Egypt. And But the thing is, though, you wouldn't have this whole problem with the whole thing with the Red Sea and Iran. And I don't know if that's a viable thing, but it would seem like, hey, who's going to lose out on that?
Yeah, well, let me explain for just a minute, and then I'll get your comments, because we have the Suez Canal, but it cannot handle oil tankers. And so this idea of the Ben Gurion Canal would be a way in which you would come up through what we call the Red Sea all the way to the Mediterranean. It would be in the southern part of Israel, but like you said, it would also involve Egypt. It really would make some sense, but it would be pretty expensive, but it would at least solve some of the issues. Now, Saudi Arabia solved some of the others because they do have a pipeline that they've sent west, and for a while it was, I don't know if it was destroyed or was inactive, but they're now using that, so they don't necessarily always have to send their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Unfortunately, pretty much UAE, Qatar, and of course Iran have to, just because of the nature of geography. But providing alternatives to a choke point, I think that makes a great deal of sense. I just think the expense, if you thought the Panama Canal was expensive, just imagine the length that the Ben Gurion Canal would have to go. But it is at least a theoretical option, and I'm glad you brought it up. Any other thoughts?
Well, the thing about it is, though, that it would also pick up commerce, too, because the ships would be bigger. Plus,
sure.
They would be able to go both ways, where the canal that there is now can only go one way. And when the ship got stuck between the canals, it held up the same problem that they've got now, only it wasn't at wartime.
Right. And again, that was one of those places where it just simply got stuck, and just illustrates again the limitations, the natural limitations of the Suez Canal. So, Kathy, I'm glad you brought it up. And again, we will probably do more on the whole geography. I didn't post it today, but we can put it up there. Of course, you can just look for Ken Timmerman's Threat Watch. When you look at the Suez Canal, when you look at the Strait of Hormuz, you look at some of that, there's some other factors, and I don't want to get too much into the deep weeds, but it illustrates again why some people are wondering, well, why is this a problem? I was in a meeting just a few days ago. Somebody put up their hand, and she said, well, given the fact we only get oil from maybe 5% of our oil from the Strait of Hormuz, how does that affect us? Well, be very grateful right now that you live in the United States of America, because we could probably less than, and during the 1970s, handle this oil shock. That being said, though, that does affect the rest of the world, and what affects the rest of the world affects us. So we can have a debate. As I point out here, there is one economist that was saying, look, the world economy cannot survive a 7 to 11% loss of oil supply. And in one of the interviews was saying, look, I'll be honest, I don't know who would collapse first, Asia, whether it be Europe, wherever it might be, or even America. But this is not a time in which we want such a massive shock to the economy. So wherever you stood on whether or not we should have been involved in the war of Iran, we're here now. And I think it's just something to point out. So, Kathy, I appreciate that. We will certainly, over these next few days, cover this again. And, of course, there will be our Friday weekend edition, which we do that as well. As a program note, let me just mention real quickly before we get on to our next article that tomorrow I have our good friend Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, and his book is right now #1 on Amazon in that category on the Jesus Discoveries. So we did talk briefly about a few of those that are in his book when we talked with an individual who was on the program a few weeks ago, Titus Kennedy, on archaeology. But this one are going to be just the discoveries that just validate the historical reality of Jesus, and I think you will appreciate that. And it is one of those conversations which you probably, if you've been out on the internet, have seen him having with Glenn Beck and Tucker Carlson and all sorts of individuals. But one of the things I thought I might do is, at least in the last half of the interview, open up the phone so you could ask him one of your questions that you might want to ask him about, and then we'll, of course, get back into some other issues in the news. Just before we get into another topic, let me once again point out that we've posted a couple of very good articles, and one which is a pretty short article, but it's worth mentioning. It's by our friend James Freeman. The Great Migration Continues, and that is more and more people are leaving California. By the way, for our California listeners, we're not sure who your next governor will be, but I think you have one less candidate, but we'll leave that for another day. And he points out that if you look at, for example, the Houston Chronicle, Houston suburbs are still booming, but how long will it last is a question in one of the headlines there. You can go to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and hear the same question being asked about what's going on in Dallas, because that article says Dallas-Fort Worth grew by 123,557 people between 2024 and 2025, second most of any metro area in the country, according to the estimates that came from the U.S. Census Bureau. The Houston metro area ranked first in numerical growth, bringing in 126,720. Austin was 6th. San Antonio was 9th. Do we see a trend? Yes, Texas has some of the biggest boom towns, but then James Freeman reminds us that on a percentage growth, the fastest growing metropolitan areas are in Ocala, Florida, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And again, he says, notice a pattern. Americans continue to choose inexpensive, modest government over jurisdictions run by ambitious ideologues. And he says it's not just about the weather, because, that's always the answer. Well, they're moving to Texas, they're moving to Florida, they're moving to South Carolina, because that's just better weather. Well, think about Los Angeles for a minute, because Los Angeles used to be, in this particular piece in the Los Angeles Times, one of the most dynamic boom towns in U.S. history, and yet it has now led the nation in numeric population loss for all but one of the last 8 years. So again, as James Freeman points out, why would anybody want to leave Southern California? Such great weather, the mountains, the beach, and everything else. Well, has to do with the fact that, I don't know, maybe life is really inexpensive there. Expensive, I should say. Life is not inexpensive. Life is very expensive. And it's not very safe either. And so then you might move north, as he says. Let's go to, Silicon Valley. And here, the San Jose Mercury News reports that the population of Silicon Valley is still below its pre-COVID levels. In, for example, the San Jose Unified School District, enrollment has dropped 20%. If you look at the Second Harvest Food Bank, which serves Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, now provide food to 500,000 people each month, roughly double the number it served before the pandemic. And you just start seeing that there are a lot of people that are moving out of California. And, of course, he's sort of picking on California, but we can talk about New York, talk about Illinois, and talk about a number of other places where we broadcast. And the Great Migration continues. I do have a commentary that I've done on this. Matter of fact, a few commentaries. I do have a booklet that we made available as well about the fact that people are leaving more and more, and that is something that we will continue to watch here on Point of View. But I thought as we get into that, it was just worth a mention about the fact that there are just a lot of U-Haul trailers, Ryder trucks, and others that are going one direction, aren't necessarily going back the other direction. And that migration that we have been talking about over the last decade or so is still continuing, maybe even intensifying in a way that many people did not anticipate taking place. So we'll see how that unfolds, but it's one of those topics we will continue to talk about here on Point of View. After the break, very good piece that came out on Gen Z by an individual that probably wouldn't necessarily agree with all the things we talk about here on Point of View, and in some respects leaves out the spiritual component, which I'll add to it, but why Gen Z is reclaiming family and faith. Fascinating piece. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thought we'd end by talking a little bit about Generation Z, and I know we have some next-generation roundtables coming up in the future, and this might be a topic they would want to revisit. Lisa Rue is not necessarily somebody who would agree with everything we talk about around the program. She actually is one of the directors of the Global Health and Evaluation for the Institute for Women's Health in Washington, D.C., but she notices something about Gen Z looking at family and faith, and I thought in some respects it was an intriguing look. She talks about the fact that my mother's home is a living gallery of the past, filled with antiques, heavy dark woods, intricate carvings, unique pieces that carry the weight of decades. And she says, while millennials largely rejected the antiques of both home and life for kind of a sleek minimalism, I've noticed a surprising shift in my own family. My 14-year-old granddaughter, part of the so-called tail end of Gen Z, is captivated by antique stores. And the issue's not the antiques, as it is kind of looking back for maybe a sense of history. And she says, Generation Z seeks quality, connection, and predictability, but served with a side of radical honesty. They are tired of this kind of curated perfection of social media where you're just giving basically the highlights of your life and the hollow success stories of past generations. Like she says, a hand-carved mahogany desk. They appreciate the flawed, uneven, but intricate and strong. And the point she's making is that there is really kind of a hunger for authenticity and maybe a sense of history, which she identifies as more visible among Gen Z as they approach such things as partnership and parenthood. She says, despite the headlines suggesting a loneliness epidemic, and believe me, we've done commentaries on that. I've done a booklet on that. It was a chapter in one of my books years ago. She says, that necessarily isn't always the case. Despite some of these headlines on a loneliness epidemic or a total rejection of tradition, she says the data shows maybe a more nuanced story. A substantial majority of people that are in the Gen Z era still envision a committed, often marital partnership. They haven't abandoned the dream of family. They're simply more deliberate about the foundations upon which it's built. Good piece. He says, interestingly enough, Gen Z holds both progressive and deeply pragmatic views of the world. While they fiercely support an individual's freedom to choose their own path, they're also keenly aware of the outcomes. She then cites Pew Research, which we cite so often. Pew Research shows that many recognize the challenges of single parenthood not as a moral judgment, but just as a realistic observation. They understand the benefits of two parents, stable households, and perhaps more than any generation in recent memory, they want stability for themselves. Again, they've been affected by the downturn in 2008. They've been affected by, wars and terrorism and all sorts of things. So the point is, as Lisa LaRue says, they're seeking, if you will, the antique model of family, not because it's old-fashioned, but because it has proven its resilience, which I think is interesting, if especially you're going to be somewhat pragmatic about what is going to work. Maybe you go back and say, what has worked for centuries? Oh, a father and a mother, stable marriages, commitment, fidelity, all those things that the 60s generation and even the 1990s generation seem to throw out. And so then she says we must encourage what they at the Institute for Women's Health call the 3-generation model. And that is understanding the family of origin, the current family environment, and the intentional planning for future family life. Without blueprints, we cannot expect Gen Z to build good, stable homes. In some respects, although this is my last piece, it connects all the way back to those of you that were listening more than an hour ago to the conversation we had with Al and Autumn Ray, which they were talking about their coaching that they do at MarriageTeam. Because again, if you come from a different family of origin, you're going to come with different kind of expectations. If you don't understand your current environment, and if you don't have a plan, or in this case, a playbook, as they called it, for future family growth, it's not going to be very successful. So even though this particular group's looking at it in a more probably secular mindset, it connects just very well with those of us that look at it from a biblical mindset as well. Then she goes on to say, again, something we've documented so often on Point of View, the science backs this up. Matter of fact, a research piece that came out from the Journal of the American Medical Association actually talks about something which I think is pretty obvious. But as I've said before, sometimes we spend millions of dollars on research to basically discover what the average mom already knows. And that is children who are deeply connected to their parents grow into more connected and resilient adults. What a surprise. But okay, now we have documentation from the Journal of the American Medical Association. Furthermore, the presence of what's called a positive childhood experience, a PCE as they call it, is one of the strongest predictors of positive health outcomes in adulthood. Stability isn't a moral preference, it's a public health necessity. Again, have to agree with that as well. Being truly authentic with Gen Z means confronting the truth often whispered or ignored by popular culture. The realities of the fertility window, the birth gap, and the economic pressures on starting a family. Pretending that the biological clock is a myth or that financial hurdles will just magically disappear doesn't do them real favors. They deserve clear, honest communication and information so they can make empowered choices rather than waking up to reality they didn't plan for. So finally, she says, Gen Z is standing in the antique store of human history, examining the heavy, sometimes scarred institutions of marriage and parenthood. They see the scratches, the uneven legs, and the faded finish, but they also see the strength. They see these structures, though flawed, were built to last. And again, if we're going to support the next generation, they says we need to provide them with some of the facts that, quite frankly, apparently they're trying to provide there at the Institute for Women's Health, and we certainly have been trying to provide here on Point of View. We know what works, first of all, because the Bible says it, Number two, we even know what works even apart from the Bible because we can see what has worked for millennia. And there has been true willingness on the part of especially some to jettison all those very important principles and ideas. And it's why we need to come back to some of the playbook, which we find in the Bible. So again, we started with Marriage Team and their playbook. We ended with this whole idea of Gen Z, and maybe they're discovering some things. We do know that there is a very small, I think it's overplayed, but there is a small uptick in some Gen Z going back to church and a small uptick of men that are Gen Z going back to church. I don't want to overplay that. Matter of fact, we're going to cover that in the future. There have been some that have maybe said too much and made too much of an extrapolation, but we'll take even a small victory at the moment, and that's certainly something to be watching here as well. That's all we have for today. Hope you'll join us tomorrow. Dr. Jeremiah Johnston with us as we talk about the Jesus discoveries. And most importantly, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Go to the website today. You can find out more about the Marriage Team. You can find some of the articles we've posted about what is happening in Iran. But also, I point you to the two articles we've just mentioned, The Great Migration and Gen Z and Family and Faith. Kind of things we talk about every day here on Point of View. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.